Oh, and good evening. It's December 3rd, 2024, and we're continuing our discussion in our collection of our Outside the Class series. Because this series is from the Bible Project, and it covers the entire TaNaK, right? That Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, all of those source videos are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture, say from Tim and John first. The lectures can be found in that source video playlist because we want to try to keep these to about 15 minutes. We want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. But the reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these with more people, if they wish. So in this series, right, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So as we get past the first 5, it could get interesting. Remember, the videos we're going to discuss, they're literally just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. They can all be found, of course, on the Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Deuteronomy. Devarim. This is our part 2. So we begin this part with Tim providing an excellent overview of the book's scope, right? Its layout. We have Moses' opening speech. Then we have a list of instructions. Then Moses' closing speech. So at least from a cursory review on my end, we have reached a point where an author is going, okay, here's my intro. And I'm reminding us again of why we're here, right? This is the setup. But I want us to keep in mind this thought of the meaning of Deuteronomy, right? That second law, right? And I want to keep it in the back of our heads because I think eventually there's going to be something else we need to consider. Let's remember that when we get to some of the context points that we're going to get to 40 years later, this is the death, the entire generation has occurred, and now there are new people. What are they committing to? They've grown up now, but they weren't in the beginning. Let's see where it takes us. So I love the beginning where he gives a speech, right? As Tim says, we're talking about that rebellious generation. This admonishment, it's personal because it discusses your folks and families. You know, as I like to look at it, these would have been our folks and families as we sit here today if we were in the story. So this is not a detached story about something else that happened and something they're listening to. This is a rehashing of their history and what their parents had done, and a reminder that they had to all die before we get to this point now in the story, the beginning of Deuteronomy. Again, I often say it here, I'm putting myself in their shoes. So when I'm listening, it's hard to listen to why we're here. It's our parents' fault. We are here because of the choices of all of our parents. They committed to a covenant, then they doubted God and the provisions from God during these last 40 years. So now that's set the stage. They're being reminded of the severity of this moment. They're at the base of their own metaphorical Mount Sinai, right? Because Moses reminds them that everything that's happened and the choices that they, like their parents, that they will now need to make, but this time, they're the ones that will be making it. Because as we roll into that second section, they are again, because we've lived this, some different things have emerged. Some need to be revisited. So when we discuss the instructions in this scroll, we might do some more things. So I love that Tim brings up the center section of this part of the intro that they're talking about, reminding them that the famous Shema comes here after we talk about their commitment and the lack thereof before. Funny enough, as I put this part of the script together, my Shema reminder popped up on my phone at 3 p.m. Bing! Yeah. So that 3 o'clock reminder in my Lord's Prayer Shema reminder for the day. I happen to have it at 9 and 3. Oh no, sorry, I'm just personally sharing something that's a total side note. Total side note. It's my Shema thing. But the Shema is important. So I want to recite it to you. You know, I know you've heard this song. You've heard Tim sing it if you've followed some of my other videos, because he sings two things. He sings the Shema and he sings the Aaronic blessing. Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. That's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. He reminds us to listen, right? But in Hebrew, if there's more to it, right? He mentions here, if we respond correctly, that he says it equals obedience, obey. I think we might want to stretch that a bit, right? Because I think stretching actually means obeying. It means responding to your hearing. What does your response mean? What are you going to do? The obedience, or to obey, right? When you obey something, is something merely that God has said, right? This is the response that God would like to see. That's why we obey. We obey because God, whom we follow, says, I'd like to see this happen. So we respond in that manner. Because we hear things and we respond constantly. This is how we do. I'm not convinced that sometimes our responses might be more rebellion to those statements than they are obedience. But we're called to Shema. So I guess if we do use the word Shema, we want to use this word and we want to draw those other pictures around it. So we're going to choose in my response how I'm going to respond, that I will examine how God has asked me to respond in these situations for these reasons and these concerns regarding these different events in our lives. So if we do that with that thought in mind, that when Tim got to the part where they said, okay, when we respond this way, Shema, the way God expects us to respond, that it's going to look very different and unique from the outside. Because obedience to God, it will look different from everybody else, right? All the nations inside the land that they're going to occupy, well, those people groups, it's probably a better choice of word, but as all the nations all around them anyways, and mainly in part, I think we're very different, and the points noted often were directly back to Egypt, right? Because that's really their most recent reference point, but it's going to look so different to everybody else. It always interests me when we get to these discussions with these laws, these instructions, these wisdom and knowledge points. Sometimes we say, okay, but these people were asked to do this, and they struggled with it. Let's be honest. But then it seems that we now say that these are all bad because they struggled to do them. So are we blaming God who set them up and said, see, you can't do this? that makes me very uncomfortable when someone says or implies that God set them up for failure. Because it seems like a dangerous and actually rather slippery slope. Because I think we'll see when we discuss these instructions in this section, I think we're going to hear Moses implore, right? He's asking them to do this. I think he's explaining why they want to do it. And they're also explaining how it's going to play out. So it'll be interesting because we're dealing with some very pointed language here. After all, when we get there, we're literally going to hear about them discussing life and death. So I think Tim, when he makes an excellent point that the Shema, when you listen, that response, the obedience, but then he turns it to love, right? That love component, that emotion is present in that decision. And at times, with that love of God, it's going to carry you through it. And I like that emotion carries us through actions, through our obedience, maybe even our disobedience. Because emotion is very much tied into it. We will have moments when we're in a good space, in an excellent mood, things are going well. Do we choose to obey or not to obey? And we're also going to be in the space where things are not going so well. The challenge is in the obedience. And which one makes us choose not to obey for reasons that are up for much discussion. But I think we're going to see this unfold as Moses makes this case for these children. Because they were kids before, and now a new group of adults exists. Because except for Moses, for Joshua, for Caleb, the oldest here is technically not even 60. It's weird when I think of that age, right? Because I think I'm now, my wife and I are now at the oldest of this generation, right? These kids, they were under 20. That was 40 years ago. Now, 40 years later, they're going on 60. So everyone else behind me, from that newborn all the way to the adults, they're now going to bear the consequences of our choices as we have matured into those adults. And we prepare to enter the land after those 40 years. So yeah, maybe I do need a reminder. Maybe I need to be emboldened so that God can say, and Moses is telling them, you can do this. And the land you're going to move into, it's going to be wonderful when you do. Because we heard that report card 40 years ago. Just imagine what it looks like now. I think this is why the scroll of Deuteronomy is so essential. It's their reminder. Because it's an account of the story to ensure that Moses prepares this group of grown-up children and he reminds them of their forefathers' vow and what their commitment to God's accountability will now be for them and those that follow. Because I think this will make this look into the scroll of Deuteronomy so fun and so vital. I mean, the purpose of this story is different from that of the scrolls before it. I think maybe that's why we get that Genesis chapter 2 deja vu feel for this scroll. I think it'll continue to be a fun journey. So thanks for with us tonight on another Outside the Class episode on the Dusty Feet.